The stagecoach had been rattling for 6 hours by the time the land flattened out into something that felt less like earth and more like a held breath. Wren Cauley sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, the way her mother had taught her before her mother had the chance to teach her anything else. Outside the window, Wyoming stretched in every direction without apology. Brown grass, gold grass, sky so wide and pale. It looked like the color had been worn out of it. No trees to speak of, no shade, just land going on and on until it met a horizon that never seemed to get any closer no matter how long the horses walked toward it. She had been watching it for the last hour, and it had not once watched her back. That was fine. She was used to being the one who looked. The contract was folded in the pocket of her coat, pressed flat against her ribs where she could feel the edges of it with every breath she took. She did not need to take it out. She had read it so many times in the 2 weeks since it arrived that the words had worn grooves into her memory, the way water wears grooves into stone, slowly and completely, and without any effort at all. I need a woman who can work. I don't need anything else. 8 words. No mention of beauty, no mention of grace or refinement or any of the qualities that the women in St. Louis had spent their entire lives cultivating like prize roses in glass houses, tending them carefully against any weather that might roughen the petals. 8 plain words from a man named Callum Hare, rancher, Bitter Creek, Wyoming, widowed, who had paid the broker's fee and sent a train ticket without ever asking what she looked like. She had told him anyway. She had written 3 sentences in her reply letter, plain and direct, the way she wrote everything, the way she did most things, without decoration and without apology. I am not considered pretty. I work hard and I do not complain. If that is enough, I will come. She had sealed the envelope before she could change her mind, and she had not slept well in the 2 weeks since, lying awake in the narrow room above the Hartwell factory dormitory, listening to the sound of other women breathing in the dark and wondering what she had set in motion. The woman sitting across from her shifted in her seat, and Wren felt the familiar pull of another person's attention moving over her like a hand checking inventory. She did not look up. She already knew what she would see. She had seen it her whole life, the small involuntary survey that other women performed, starting at the top and working methodically downward, the slight adjustment of expression when they reached their conclusion, that quiet rearrangement of features that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Not pretty enough. Not the kind of woman a man keeps. Her hands rested quiet in her lap. She looked at them the way she sometimes did when she needed to remind herself of something solid and true. The left thumb carried a scar running diagonally across the pad, white and smooth now, from a machine blade at the Hartwell factory 3 winters ago. She had wrapped it herself with strips torn from her underskirt, and gone back to the line the same afternoon because missing work meant missing wages, and missing wages meant consequences she could not afford. The palms were thick with callus, built up layer by layer over years of work that did not care whether you were tired or cold or grieving. The skin at her knuckles was dry and slightly cracked from the lye soap they used in the washing rooms. The kind of crack that never fully healed because there was never enough time between one soaking and the next for the skin to close itself properly. Her nails were cut short and uneven because she had trimmed them herself by lamplight the night before leaving St. Louis, and she had been in too much of a hurry to do it carefully. These were not hands that had ever worn silk gloves. These were hands that had wrung water from heavy cloth at 4 a.m. when the floor of the washing room was cold enough to feel through 2 pairs of wool socks. Hands that had spooned medicine between her mother's cracked lips when she was 13 years old, and her mother was dying of the lung fever, and there was no one else in the house to do it, and no money to pay anyone who might have come. Hands that had learned to move through the world carefully, efficiently, without taking up more space than was strictly necessary, because the world had made it clear early and often that space was not something freely given to women like her. She closed them loosely in her lap and looked back out the window. The land was still going on without her. Her bag sat on the floor between her feet, and inside it, beneath her spare dress and the 2 handkerchiefs and the small tin of dried chamomile she carried everywhere out of habit, was the book. Her mother's book. It was old in the particular way of things that have been used rather than merely kept. The spine cracked and reinforced with a strip of leather her mother had stitched on herself, the pages soft as worn cloth from years of handling, the edges dark with the oils of many hands. Her mother had written notes in the margins in a small, precise hand that took up every available inch of white space, remedies and warnings and occasional observations about the nature of plants and people that had seemed, when Wren was young and impatient, like the kind of slow wisdom only old women needed. She understood more of them now. The stubborn ones grow where nothing else will. That is not a flaw. That is the point. She had been 22 years old when she married Aldous Webb. He was 34, well regarded in 3 parishes, and he had the kind of face that people trusted on first sight, which turned out to be one of the more expensive qualities a man could possess because other people ended up paying for it in ways they never anticipated. She had paid for it in her own currency, in the small daily exchange of silences accepted and words swallowed and dresses chosen deliberately for their invisibility, brown and gray, and the kind of blue that nobody noticed. He had not been cruel in any way that left marks. He had been indifferent in the manner of a cold room, which does not wish you harm, which has no particular feeling about you at all, which simply does not warm for you no matter how long you stand in it. He had said it once, at a dinner party, in the home of his business associate, in the pleasant, unhurried tone of a man making comfortable conversation. She had been sitting 2 chairs down from him, and he had not looked at her when he said it, which was perhaps the detail that stayed with her longest. She doesn't photograph well. The other people at the table had moved smoothly past it the way people move past small awkwardnesses, a brief collective repositioning, someone reaching for the bread, someone asking a question about something else entirely. And Wren had kept eating. She had lifted her fork and placed food in her mouth, and chewed and swallowed and breathed, and she had not done a single visible thing that anyone could point to later as breaking. She was very accomplished at that. She had been practicing since before she knew she was practicing. He had remarried 14 months after the divorce was finalized, a younger woman with a face that reproduced clearly in photographs, and a laugh that carried pleasantly across a room. Wren had heard about the wedding from a woman she used to know and had sat with the news for a moment, feeling something smaller and more complicated than the feeling she anticipated. Not grief exactly, not anger either. The low, persistent ache of a bone that took a blow a long time ago and healed imperfectly and makes itself known only when the weather changes. The weather in Wyoming was already changing. She could feel it in the quality of the light coming through the window, sharper and more transparent than Missouri light, the kind of light that did not soften edges but showed them plainly. She thought there might be something honest about that. She thought she might be able to live in it. She pressed her fingers against her coat pocket and felt the edges of the contract through the wool. The stagecoach lurched hard over a rut, and the woman in lavender grabbed the door frame with both gloved hands and made a sound of distress. Wren did not move. She had braced herself against the seat 3 seconds before the impact because she had been watching the road through the window and had seen the rut coming and had adjusted without thinking. The small automatic recalibration of someone who had learned to see trouble arriving and prepare for it quietly, without making a production of the preparation. Outside, a cluster of wooden shapes resolved themselves slowly into buildings. Bitter Creek, Wyoming. A general store with a painted sign faded by sun to near illegibility. A blacksmith shop open on 2 sides. The sound of hammer on iron carrying clearly through the dry air. A barber shop with a striped post listing slightly. A church built of unpainted boards, its single window facing west, leaning a few degrees from true vertical in a way that suggested the foundation had settled unevenly and the congregation had decided to make peace with it rather than correct it. No grand facades, no attempt at impressiveness, just wood and dust, and the specific plainness of a place that had been built by people who needed it to work rather than to look like anything in particular. The driver called out the name of the town, and the horses slowed, and the stagecoach came to a stop with one final shudder that rattled the window in its frame. Wren's heart did something unsteady in her chest. She steadied it the same way she steadied everything, from the inside, without showing the work. She was afraid. That was the honest name for it. Not of the man she was about to meet. Not of the work, or the land, or the life waiting beyond this dusty road. She was afraid of being wrong again. Of having made the same calculation she had made at 22, looked at a set of facts and drawn from them the wrong conclusion, and walked forward, came into it with her eyes open and her hands steady and still gotten it exactly backward. She stepped down from the coach. The ground was dry and pale, and the dust rose around her boots in small, quiet clouds. She straightened her coat and settled the strap of her bag on her shoulder and looked. He was standing beside a wagon hitched to 2 horses that had the patient, resigned posture of animals that had spent years doing hard work alongside a man who asked a great deal of them and did not waste words about it. He was taller than she had expected, broader through the chest and shoulders, wearing a canvas coat that had been mended at the left elbow with a slightly different thread. The repair visible only if you were the kind of person who looked at things carefully. His hat was pulled low enough that she could not fully see his eyes from where she stood. His face was weathered and still, carved by years of outdoor work and wind and sun into something that had stopped pretending to be young and was simply, entirely, what it was. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he is not sure yet how to solve. She walked toward him because there was no one else it could possibly be, and because standing still had never been something she could manage when there was a direction to move in. He said nothing when she stopped 2 feet in front of him. She had prepared words. She had built them carefully over the long train ride from St. Louis, arranged them into a sensible order, practical and clear. But standing in the dust of Bitter Creek with the Wyoming sky enormous and indifferent overhead, and this silent, weathered man looking at her from under the brim of his hat, every prepared word dissolved as though it had never existed. And what came out instead was the truth, raw and undecorated and entirely hers. "I'm not beautiful." Her voice did not shake. She was proud of that, even as she heard herself saying the words, even as she felt the familiar tightening along her jaw that came with exposure. "The photograph wasn't clear, and I didn't correct it when I wrote to you. I should have. I know that. But I can work harder than most men I have met, and I keep my word without being reminded, and I do not complain about things I cannot change. I just thought you deserved to know the rest before we went any further." She stopped talking. He looked at her for a moment that stretched in the dry September air. Then he turned away. The bottom dropped cleanly out of her stomach. She stood very still and watched his broad back and understood, with the particular lucidity that comes to women who have spent years learning to absorb impact without staggering, that this was how it ended. A 3-day train ride across 4 states, a contract folded against her ribs for 2 weeks, her mother's book in her bag, and 8 words burned into her memory, and all of it amounting to this: a man in a worn canvas coat turning away before she had even taken her second breath in Wyoming. She was already calculating the return ticket, already measuring the distance back to the stagecoach, already, somewhere quiet in the back of her mind, not surprised. And then he reached into the wagon bed and straightened back up with a tin cup in his hand, steam rising from it in a thin, pale thread against the cold air, and he turned back and held it out to her. "Long ride," he said. "You must be thirsty." She looked at the cup for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. A plain tin cup, dented on one side, the handle worn smooth from years of use. Steam rising from it in the September morning air. The most ordinary object in the world. She reached out and took it. Her fingers brushed across the backs of his knuckles as the cup passed between them. His skin was rough and warm, the joints thickened from years of work, the kind of hands that had been doing hard things for so long. They had simply become part of the work itself and stopped making any distinction between the two. Hands like hers. She wrapped both her palms around the cup and drank. The coffee was hot and slightly bitter, and tasted faintly of the tin it had been carried in, and she drank it standing in the road while he lifted her bag from the ground and set it into the wagon without comment or ceremony or any unnecessary movement at all. No compliment, no reassurance, no rejection either. Only the coffee and the quiet and the straightforward, practical kindness of a man who had noticed she was thirsty and had done something about it before she had to ask. She was climbing up onto the wagon seat when she saw them. She had not been looking. She had been watching where she put her hands on the wooden frame, and she had turned her head at some small involuntary angle, and her eye had caught the corner of the wagon bed just behind the seat and registered what was there before her mind had quite caught up to what she was seeing. A pair of women's boots. Small, narrow at the toe, made for feet considerably smaller than her own. The leather was dry and had cracked along the toe box the way leather does when it has gone a long time without oil. But the boots themselves were well made. The kind a woman would have saved for and worn carefully. The kind that meant something to the person who owned them. They were wrapped in a piece of brown cloth, folded over twice and tucked against the side of the wagon with the deliberate placement of something set down intentionally. Not dropped and not forgotten. Kept. He settled onto the seat beside her and took up the reins without looking at her, and the horses moved forward, and Bitter Creek fell away behind them, and neither of them spoke. She looked at the grass moving in long, slow waves across the open land, the wind crossing it from the west, and she did not ask about the boots, because she recognized in the way they had been wrapped and placed the particular care of grief. The small rituals of someone who could not yet let go and had found a way to carry the unlet-goable thing that kept it close without making it impossible to move through an ordinary day. She understood that kind of carrying. The ranch appeared after nearly an hour, a farmhouse of weathered gray boards, a porch with a single rocking chair facing the open ground, a barn repaired in patches with newer wood not yet worn to match the gray of the old. No flowers anywhere. No curtains in the windows. No softness visible from the road. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old ash, and beneath both of those, something so faint it was almost a memory of a smell. Herbs or dried flowers. Someone's particular way of keeping a home, worn down to almost nothing over 2 years of a man living alone inside it. He set her bag down in the narrow hallway. "Kitchen's here," he said. "Bedroom's in the back. I had the lock replaced last month." She nodded. He said he would sleep in the barn. She did not argue. She understood without requiring explanation that this was not an act of coldness. He was giving her the house. He was giving her the lock. He was removing himself from the equation until she knew what the equation was. The bedroom had a new lock. She tested it after he left. It turned smoothly and held firm. She crossed to the window and looked out at the back of the property. Behind the house, running along the east side where the afternoon light would have been good, was what had once been a garden. The raised beds were still there, the wood gray and splitting, but the soil inside them was cracked earth and brittle, dead stems, the kind of dryness that came not from a single bad season, but from years of being left alone. "How long since anything grew here?" she asked quietly. 2 years, he said. 2 years. The same amount of time that chair had been pushed against the wall. The same amount of time the dust had been settling on the Bible by the window. That night she lay in the narrow bed and listened to the coyotes carry their conversation across the dark miles of open ground, and she thought about the garden she had seen through the back window, dead for 2 years, the raised beds still holding their shape in the dry earth like the outline of something that had once been tended. She thought about the boots wrapped in brown cloth. She thought about 8 words pressed against her ribs for 2 weeks. And sometime deep in the night, in the long, still hours before dawn when the coyotes had gone quiet and the dark was complete, and the ranch sat silent under the enormous Wyoming sky, she heard it. Faint and brief and almost nothing. The particular quiet sound of paper being handled by careful hands in the dark. The sound of something read and set down and read again. The sound of a man who could not sleep reaching in the dark for the one thing that made the silence slightly less than total. She lay still and listened and said nothing and did not move. But she heard it, and she filed it away in the careful place where she kept things that mattered, next to her mother's notes in the margins and the weight of a tin cup warm between her palms. Next to the knowledge that a man who gives a woman a room with a working lock is telling her something important about who he is, whether he means to or not. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in long, slow waves, the same motion as water, the same patience as anything that is learned to keep going without being thanked for it. She was still here. That for tonight was enough. She rose before dawn the next morning and did what she always did when she could not sleep any longer, and the dark outside was the particular dark of 4 a.m, which is different from all the other darks of the night, thinner somehow, more provisional, as though the dark itself knows it is being replaced and has already started the process of becoming something else. She built the fire and set the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window with her shawl around her shoulders and looked at the shape of the ranch in the last of the dark. The barn, the fence lines running out in both directions, the cottonwood trees at the back of the property, their branches bare now, the leaves already gone in the early October cold that came down from the mountains at night, the garden beds, still dead, still holding their shape in the dry earth like an argument no one had won. She had grown up watching her mother do this. Stand at whatever window the current house had and look at whatever the dark contained before she began the work of the day. It was not a contemplative habit exactly, not prayer and not planning. It was more like taking inventory. Like a person patting their pockets to be sure they still had what they needed before they walked out into whatever the day intended to be. Wren had inherited the habit along with the book. She looked at the dead garden and thought about what it would take to bring it back. The spring she had identified under the oak tree, the one that was not dry but only blocked and diverted and waiting. She had pressed her fingers into the soil there twice now and felt the same thing each time, that slight temperature differential, that barely perceptible coolness that the earth held when water was moving somewhere beneath it. She was not wrong about it. She had read enough of her mother's notes to know the difference between wishful thinking and evidence, and this was evidence. The question was whether Callum would believe her before she could prove it. She did not know yet. She did not know much about him yet, except what she had collected in the way she collected everything, by observation rather than inquiry. He was methodical. He did not leave tools where he had used them. He did not let small repairs become large ones. He kept his animals well. He had given her a locked room and a cup of coffee and had not once, in 2 days, said a single thing he did not mean. These were not small things. She poured a cup of coffee when it was ready and left one on the edge of the stove for him and went outside in the gray pre-dawn cold with her own cup and stood in the yard and looked at the oak tree and made her decision the way she made most decisions, quietly and without announcement, by simply deciding and then beginning to plan how to do it. She was going to need a spade, and time, and the particular patience that belongs to a person who has learned that nothing worth finding is ever at the surface. She was awake before the light, not because something woke her, but because sleeping past dark had always felt like a small surrender she could not afford, a habit built across years in the factory dormitory where the morning bell came without warning, and the women who were already dressed when it rang were the ones who kept their positions through the lean seasons. Wren rose in the dark and dressed by feel, her fingers finding each button with the efficiency of long practice. The floor was cold through her wool stockings. The window above the bed showed a sky that was not yet gray, only a slightly lesser darkness than the darkness inside the room. The way the hour before dawn distinguishes itself from the hour before that, not by light, but by a barely perceptible change in the quality of the waiting, as though the dark itself has begun to lean toward something. She unlocked her door and moved through the silent house. The stove was cold. She found the wood box beside it and built the fire the way her mother had taught her, paper first, then kindling laid in a cross pattern to let the air move through, then the smallest split logs balanced carefully over the top. She had the fire going before the first gray line appeared at the bottom of the eastern sky. She filled the coffee pot from the water barrel near the door and set it on the iron and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dead garden while the house began, slowly and with some reluctance, to warm around her. She could hear him in the barn, not his voice, only movement, the low sound of a man working in the dark, the creak of a stall door opening, the brief stamp of a horse's hoof on packed earth, the soft rhythmic pull of hay being forked from one place to another, the particular quiet that falls between one task and the next when a person has been doing the same morning work for so long that the body moves through it without needing to be consulted. He did not come in for coffee. She poured a cup anyway and set it on the edge of the stove where it would stay warm, and she took her own cup outside and walked to the garden. The soil in the raised beds crumbled like ash between her fingers, dry all the way down to where the roots of the dead weeds had gone hard and brittle. She worked her way slowly along each bed, pressing her fingers down into the soil every few inches, reading the ground the way her mother had taught her to read it, not as a surface, but as a record, a document of everything that had and had not happened to it across time. She was crouched at the far end of the last bed, her fingers dark with dry soil. when she heard the fence post creak and looked up. The boy was standing on the second rail of the fence that separated the yard from the open pasture, his arms folded over the top rail, his chin resting on his forearms, watching her with the specific quality of attention that belongs to children who have spent considerable time around adults in various states of difficulty and have learned to observe before they speak. He was small and thin, with hair the color of old straw that stuck out from under his hat brim at several independent angles. His boots were too large for him, the kind that had been bought with growing in mind and had not yet been grown into. He looked at her with gray eyes that were doing more work than a 9-year-old's eyes should need to do. "The last one never came outside," he said. He dropped off the fence rail and turned and ran across the pasture before she could answer, his oversized boots leaving dark marks in the dew-wet grass, and was gone behind the barn before she had fully straightened to her feet. She stood there in the dead garden with dry dirt on her hands and thought about what he had said. A woman inside the house. The door closed. The garden ignored. A boy watching from a fence rail, learning day by day what a person looks like when they have decided not to try. She went back inside and washed her hands and began making breakfast. 3 days passed in this way. Callum left before she woke and returned after dark, and the ranch existed between them as a shared space that they navigated with the careful precision of two people who did not yet know each other's patterns and were being watchful not to collide. He ate what she left on the stove. She found firewood split and stacked beside the back door each morning without having asked for it and without any mention being made of it by either of them. The second chair remained against the wall. On the fourth morning, she found the mare. She had gone to the barn for the spade she had seen hanging on the south wall, and she heard the horse before she saw her. A low, stressed sound that was different from the ordinary sounds of the barn, different in its irregularity, in the tightness of it, the controlled quality of an animal holding pain at a manageable distance and not quite succeeding. The mare was in the far stall, bay-colored with a white mark above her left foreleg that was not quite a star and not quite a splash, but something in between. She was standing on 3 legs with the left foreleg held slightly off the ground at an angle that said clearly what the swelling at the coronary band and the heat radiating from the hoof confirmed. Infection, working its way into the tissue with the steady, unhurried patience of something that has all the time it needs. Wren went back to her room for the book. She had the remedies mixed in the tin basin, white willow bark, and dried calendula, and a small measure of the drawing salve her mother had made from beeswax and comfrey root, and she had the hoof soaking and the strips of clean cloth laid out ready by the time she heard him come in from the north pasture. She did not look up from what she was doing. The mare had accepted her hands with the exhausted trust of an animal that has moved past wariness into the simpler territory of pain and relief, and Wren had been speaking to her throughout in the low, steady murmur her mother had used with frightened creatures of every kind, not words so much as sound, the reassurance of a human voice that is not asking anything, only present. She heard him stop at the stall door. She kept her hands moving, pressing the poultice carefully into the swollen tissue above the hoof, holding it in place with steady, even pressure while she counted her own slow breaths. The silence behind her stretched long enough that she began to think he had moved on. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "My mother." She did not turn around. Her hands kept moving. She kept a book, remedies mostly, some of it very old. The plants don't know or care how old the knowledge is. She teach you herself? Until I was 13. Then she died and the book taught me the rest. She felt rather than heard him come into the stall. He moved to the opposite side of the mare and crouched and took hold of the fetlock above the infected hoof, with the practiced sureness of a man who had spent years working alongside large animals, and understood that an uncertain hand is more frightening to a horse than a firm one. He steadied the leg without being asked, without discussion, because the task made it obvious, and he was the kind of man who did the obvious thing when the obvious thing was needed. They were on opposite sides of the same animal, with their hands 12 inches apart, and the mare's breathing slowing gradually between them, and neither of them said anything more, and it was, Wren thought, the first time since her arrival that they had been doing the same work at the same moment in the same space, without one of them being incidental to the other's purpose. It was a small thing. She noted it anyway. By the time she finished and the mare was bandaged and standing on all 4 feet with a look of cautious relief, the afternoon was cooling toward evening. She washed her hands at the pump and dried them on her apron and went back to check on the horse one more time before supper. The mare turned her head when Wren came in and regarded her with the dark, patient eye of an animal that has made a decision about a person and filed it under trustworthy. Wren stayed a few minutes longer than was necessary. She did not examine too closely why she stayed. She told herself it was to check the bandage, and the bandage did need checking, but that was not entirely the reason. The barn in the late afternoon had a particular quality of light and warmth that the house did not. The house was still learning to be lived in again. The barn had never stopped being used. It smelled of hay and animals and old wood, and the particular dry, sweet smell of a space that holds living things. And standing inside it, with the light coming through the gaps in the boards in long golden lines, was, for reasons she could not entirely account for, the most comfortable she had felt since stepping off the stagecoach. She heard him come in from the far pasture just before dark and go directly to the barn to check the cattle count, which she had learned was his habit, the last thing before supper, the way some people check the locks on their doors before bed. She heard him stop at the mare's stall. She was already in the kitchen when he came in. She did not look up from the stove. He washed up at the basin and sat down and ate what she had made, which was a reasonable attempt at a beef stew given what was available in the kitchen, and at the end of it he said, without looking up from his bowl, "The mare's standing even on it. She should be fine. The infection wasn't deep." A pause. "I would have sold her," he said. "If it had gone further. Would have had to." Wren looked at him then. "I know." He looked back at her. Something shifted in his expression, very slightly, in the way things shift when a person updates a category they have been keeping a person in, not dramatically, only by a degree or two, the way a compass needle adjusts when the field changes. He went back to his stew. She went back to hers. The second chair was still against the wall, but the distance between them at the table felt, she thought, approximately 1 degree smaller than it had the night before. She went into Bitter Creek 6 days after her arrival, taking the smaller horse and the list she had been building in careful pencil on the inside cover of her mother's book since her first morning in the kitchen. The main road of Bitter Creek held its dust in the windless morning air. The general store smelled of coffee and sawdust and the dry sweetness of grain kept in barrels. Behind the counter stood a woman of 60, or perhaps a weathered 55, built with the solid economy of someone who had stopped accommodating the opinions of others at some point in her 4th decade and had found the resulting freedom so considerable that she had never looked back. Her gray hair was pinned back with functional efficiency. Her eyes were quick and direct. "You're the one who came to Drystone," the woman said. "Wren Cauley. I came to marry Callum Hare." "Greta Finch." The woman set both palms flat on the counter. "You're the third one." "I know." "The first one was Ellen. She died. Winter fever, 1878. That wasn't anything Callum did or didn't do, whatever some people have decided to believe about it. The second one was Rosalind. She came from Cheyenne, Pratt family. They thought well of themselves. What was she like? Greta Finch considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. Pretty, she said finally. The kind of pretty that knows it is, and has spent a long time deciding what to do with that fact. She came out here thinking the ranch would be different than it was, thinking he would be different than he was. Most people who come from somewhere easier think that about this land. She paused. She lasted 8 months. Why did she leave? The older woman's eyes moved briefly toward the door. She found something in the barn, she said, dropping her voice a register. Nobody knows exactly what. Letters, some people say. Something of Ellen's. Whatever it was, she was gone before sunrise the next morning. Back door left open. Callum never said a word about it. Just stood in the yard that morning looking at nothing in particular and then went back to work. Wren was quiet for a moment. You planning on staying? Greta Finch asked. I came to stay, Wren said. The older woman looked at her for a moment with those quick, assessing eyes. Ellen would have liked you, she said quietly, and went back to the shelves before Wren could respond to that. Wren had one more question before she left. Ellen, Wren said, the first wife, what was she like? Greta Finch paused and set down the tin she had been reaching for and stood for a moment with her hands resting on the counter and an expression on her face that was not grief exactly, but was the particular softening that comes over people when they think about someone they valued and lost. She was the kind of person, Greta Finch said slowly, who noticed things, not in a calculating way. She noticed things the way some people notice the weather, because paying attention to the world around her was simply how she was built. She knew every family in this town by the second month, not just their names, their situations, who needed what, and who was too proud to ask for it. She picked up the tin again and moved along the shelf. She'd have known what to do about Douglas Pratt before he'd finished tying his horse to the rail, Greta Finch added, without looking up. But then, it seems to me, so would you. When she set the final parcels on the counter and tallied the total, she added a small twist of dried lavender to the pile without noting it in the column and without meeting Wren's eyes. Wren did not mention it. Some kindnesses are received more cleanly without acknowledgement. She was tying the parcels to the saddle outside when she saw the man. He was standing in front of the barber shop on the opposite side of the street, looking at the general store with the focused stillness of someone who has a specific purpose and is deciding how to approach it efficiently. He was perhaps 44, solidly built, wearing a traveling coat and wool vest. His boots were city boots, good leather, made for floors rather than ground, the kind that spoke of a life conducted primarily indoors. He crossed the street and pushed open the door of the general store. Wren kept her hands on the knot she was tying and listened through the open window. The Drystone Ranch, the man said. His voice was measured and pleasant in the way of a voice that has been trained to sound so. Is the property still registered under Callum Hare's name alone? She heard Greta Finch's response, brief and deliberately uninformative, the practiced neutrality of a woman who had learned over 60 years that information freely given is information permanently surrendered. Wren finished the knot. She untied her horse from the rail and mounted and rode back toward Drystone at an unhurried pace that did not match the pace of her thinking. The man had not seen her. She was certain of that. She had been standing at the side of the building, partly behind the horse, and his attention had moved directly to the general store without scanning the street first. This told her something about how he operated, directly and with confidence. the way men operate when they are accustomed to walking into rooms where they are already expected to win. She rode back to Drystone and put up the horse and went inside and opened the blank ledger she had found on the kitchen shelf and wrote down everything she had seen and heard, including the man's face, his coat, his boots, and the exact words of his question. Then she made supper and set a plate on the stove for Callum and ate her own at the kitchen table alone with the evening coming in through the west window in long, flat orange bars of light. She was paying attention. She had been paying attention her entire life. It was perhaps the most reliable skill she possessed, and she intended to use it. The well gave out on the 9th day. She heard it before she saw the consequence of it. The hollow mechanical sound of the pump handle moving against nothing, water replaced by air. She worked the handle 3 more times to be certain, and the hollow sound confirmed itself each time without variation. Callum came out of the barn, and she told him with 2 words, and he came and tested it himself. "Happened last year," he said. The flatness in his voice was not indifference, but exhaustion. The bone-level tiredness of a man who has fought the same enemy enough times to have stopped expecting the outcome to change. "We can haul from the creek east of the property. It's 3 miles, but it's running." "Hauling 3 miles is not a solution," Wren said. "That is how you survive until the problem kills you more slowly. It's what there is." "Springs don't vanish," she said. "They move. They go under. But they don't disappear." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not fully read, and then he looked back at the pump, and she understood that he had stopped believing that 3 years ago and had not found a reason since to start again. She went to the barn for the spade. She had been thinking about the ground beneath the old oak since her first morning, since the moment her fingers had found that slight temperature change in the soil near its roots. That barely perceptible coolness that the earth only holds when there is water somewhere below it. She had walked the property since then, pressing her boot heel into the ground in various places, looking at where the grass was fractionally less dead, where the soil held its color a shade darker than the land around it, reading the land as a document rather than a surface. The oak was the place. She started at its base and dug. The ground resisted in the way of earth that has been packed hard by years of sun and no rain, dry and reluctant, fighting the spade blade with the passive resistance of something that has simply given up being anything other than what it currently is. Her shoulders were burning before the first 10 minutes were done. Blisters formed on her palms over the existing callus, new soft skin rising painfully beneath the old tough skin, and she noted the pain, the way she noted most discomfort, as information rather than instruction, and kept working. She dug for a long time. The October sun climbed behind her, and the shadow of the oak shortened and then lengthened in the other direction, and she dug. Her back ached in the specific way that only digging produces, the deep pull of muscles not accustomed to this particular combination of lift and twist and drive, repeated without variation for hours at a time. She had done harder physical work in the factory. She had done longer hours. She had done work that left her hands so stiff in the morning, she had to soak them in warm water before she could open them fully. But the factory work was repetitive, and the body learned it, and the mind could go elsewhere. Digging required all of her attention because the soil was different at every inch, and the only way to know where the water was going was to read the ground as she went, to feel for the changes in density and temperature and moisture, to pay attention to what the spade blade was telling her through the handle and her palms and her wrists and her arms. It was detective work, a conversation between her body and the earth in which the earth was not exactly cooperative, but was not exactly withholding either, only complex, only requiring that she pay the right kind of attention. She paid it, 1 foot down. The soil shifted almost imperceptibly, slightly darker near the blade. 18 inches. She crouched and pressed her palm flat against the floor of the hole and held it there, feeling for temperature. Cooler. Definitely cooler. The kind of cool that does not come from shade or air, but from water holding its temperature below the reach of the sun. She dug faster. 2 feet. The spade came up with soil that clung to the blade instead of falling away in dry crumbles. She set the spade aside and went to her knees in the hole and dug with her hands, pulling the earth out in cupped palmfuls, her fingers going cold with the depth of it, the soil under her nails and packed into the cracks in her knuckles. And then between one breath and the next, the ground under her palms changed from damp to wet, and water seeped up between her fingers, slow and dark and cold and entirely, undeniably real. She sat back on her heels. Her dress was ruined from the knees down. Her hands were black with wet soil. Her hair had come loose from its pins in at least 3 places. She was sitting in a hole she had dug herself in the yard of a ranch she had arrived at 9 days ago to marry a man who had given her a tin cup of coffee instead of a hello, and the cold, clean water was rising between her fingers with the unhurried patience of something that had been waiting a long time for someone to remove the obstacle above it. She laughed. She could not have said cleanly what the laugh contained. Relief was part of it. Something older than relief was the larger part. The specific release of a woman who has been told by enough people that something is not there, that the ground is dry and the effort is wasted and there is nothing to find, and has gone ahead and found it anyway. A shadow fell across the rim of the hole. She looked up. Callum stood at the edge, looking down at the water seeping steadily up between her fingers. He was completely still, the kind of stillness that is not the absence of feeling, but its opposite. The absolute stillness of someone feeling more than they know what to do with and defaulting to motionlessness while they work out what to do with the excess. He crouched at the edge and reached down and pressed 2 fingers into the wet soil beside her hand. The water welled up around them immediately, dark and cold and patient. 2 years, he said. The words came out low, aimed at the water rather than at her. It was here the whole time, Wren said. Under the oak roots. You have to get beneath them. He looked at her then, directly and without the managed distance of the past 9 days. He looked at her the way a person looks when they have briefly forgotten to decide what their face is doing. She met it without adjusting anything. She was sitting in a hole in the ground, with mud covering her hands and her face and her dress past any salvation, and her hair in disarray, and she was exactly, entirely, completely what she was. He put his hand down. She took it, and he pulled her up out of the hole, and they stood together at the edge of it and looked at the water still rising slowly, patiently, into the space she had made for it. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The morning was warm around them, and the water was cold below, and in the branches of the oak above the hole a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do, which is to say precisely what it pleased, loudly and without concern for whether anyone found it appropriate. "We'll need to line the walls before they collapse," Wren said finally. "Stone if you have it, timber if you don't, and we should pipe it to the garden before the hard freeze. I know how to line a spring." "I know you do." Another pause, shorter than the one before it, filled with something that was not yet anything nameable, but was no longer nothing. "I'll get the timber," he said. He walked back toward the barn. She watched him go, his broad back and his steady, unhurried pace and the set of his shoulders that was slightly different than it had been at the pump handle an hour ago. The specific difference in how a person carries themselves when something that has been heavy for 2 years has been, at least partially, set down. She looked down at the water. It was still rising. That evening, the second chair was at the table when she came in to make supper. Neither of them mentioned it. Later, in the dark, she lay in the narrow bed and listened to the night sounds of the ranch settling into itself. She opened the drawer and took out the ledger and held it against her chest with both hands the way her mother had held the book when the fever was bad and the night was long and the only thing that helped was keeping close the thing that mattered. She held it until she slept. The water changed everything. Not all at once, and not in any way that announced itself. It happened the way most real things happen, gradually and then all at once, in increments too small to measure individually, but whose accumulation, looked at from a distance, amounted to something undeniable. They spent 3 days mining the spring. Callum had the timber split and the stone hauled from the creek bed before she had finished breakfast on the morning after the water came in. They worked side by side in the mornings, fitting the stone into the walls of the hole with the patient precision of people who understood that a thing built quickly and carelessly would need to be built again. He showed her how to pack the clay between the stones to keep the walls from weeping, pressing it in with the heel of his palm in long, firm strokes, and she watched his hands and learned it and did it herself on her section of the wall without being told to, and he watched her do it and said nothing, which was, she had come to understand, his version of approval. By the third afternoon, they had the pipe laid from the spring to the garden beds. The first water reached the raised beds at 4 in the afternoon. Jasper had appeared at the fence rail at some point during the second day, materializing out of the open pasture the way small creatures materialize when something interesting is happening and no one has explicitly told them to stay away. He had watched the work for 2 days without saying much, handing tools when asked, fetching water when the bucket emptied. When the water finally ran through the pipe and darkened the dry soil of the first raised bed, soaking in with the eagerness of earth that has been waiting a long time for exactly this, Jasper made a sound that was something between a laugh and a held breath releasing. He looked at Wren with those gray eyes. Then he said very quietly, "Miss Ellen used to stand right here." Callum's hands went still on the pipe, fitting he had been adjusting. He did not turn around. He stayed crouched over the pipe junction with his back to both of them, and the stillness in him was different from his ordinary stillness, tighter. The stillness of someone holding something carefully rather than someone simply at rest. Wren looked at Jasper and gave him a small nod that meant she had heard and she was grateful, and this was not the moment to say more. The boy picked up the empty bucket and took it back to the barn without being asked. Callum adjusted the pipe fitting and said nothing, and the water kept running into the dark soil of the garden, and the meadowlark in the oak tree above them sang its indifferent and perfect song into the wide October sky. The garden began to breathe again. The seeds Wren had planted in the first week of her arrival, pressing them into the broken soil with her thumbs before the spring was found, because she had decided to plant them as an act of intention rather than certainty. Those seeds had been waiting underground with the patience of things that do not have the option of impatience. With water, they began to move. Small pale shoots appeared first in the bean bed, then the squash, pushing up in 2 thick-stemmed pairs. The tomato seeds she had found in a small cloth pouch in the wooden box beside the kitchen stove. A different variety than what she had planted, older and more carefully kept, had not yet shown themselves above the soil. She did not ask about the seeds. She planted them because they were seeds and seeds were meant to be planted, and because leaving them in a box was its own kind of answer to a question she did not intend to give. Callum saw her in the garden on the morning of the 4th day after the water came through. She was on her knees with her hands in the soil. "Those are hers," he said. She understood what he meant. She pressed her fingers gently around the base of the nearest tomato marker and felt the soil temperature and moisture, and thought about what she was going to say before she said it. "Ellen saved them from her last crop," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. A long pause. The water moved quietly in the pipe. Below the soil, with a sound like patience itself. "She'd want them planted," Wren said simply. She heard him draw a slow breath behind her. "Yes," he said again. Different this time. Lower. She kept her hands in the soil and said nothing more, and after a moment she heard his boots moving back toward the barn. She stood and brushed the dirt from her palms and looked at the small marked row where Ellen's seeds were waiting underground and thought about what it meant to plant something you would not be there to see grow. Her mother had understood that. She thought perhaps Ellen had too. The chair remained at the table. Supper became a thing they did together rather than a thing Wren did alone with a plate left on the stove. He was not talkative. She had stopped expecting him to be and had found, in that stopped expectation, something that felt like ease. She learned things about him the way you learn things about a landscape, not by being told, but by looking carefully over time. He left a lamp burning in the barn on cold nights, even when there was no animal that needed watching. He repaired things immediately when they broke, because he was not a man who could leave a broken thing broken once he had noticed it. He was spare with words, but not with work, which was a particular kind of honesty. She learned, too, that Jasper came to supper several evenings a week, appearing at the door with the studied casualness of a child who has decided not to make anything of what he is doing, in case someone decides to prevent it. Callum always set a third plate without comment, as though it had always been this way, as though the boy had always been there and the kitchen had always had 3 people in it. She watched them together in those evenings and thought about the specific kind of gentleness that resides in a man who does not perform gentleness but simply is it, who is kind to children and animals, not because he is trying to be kind, but because it does not occur to him to be otherwise. He answered Jasper's questions briefly and accurately about the cattle and the weather and the behavior of foxes in the cold season, and the particular reason that one stretch of fence always heaved in the frost while the rest held firm. He did not talk down to the boy. He talked to him the way he talked to Wren, as though the boy was a person capable of understanding accurate information and deserved to receive it. Douglas Pratt had said Callum Hare had nothing left to give. Wren watched him set a third plate at the table and thought that Douglas Pratt had never looked at anything carefully enough to see what it actually contained. She also learned, by accident, that he had a dry and almost entirely concealed sense of humor. It appeared for the first time on an evening when she had attempted to make cornbread and had miscalculated the heat and produced something that was burnt on the outside and uncertain in the middle. She had set it on the table and looked at it and said, without directing the comment at anyone in particular, "I've made worse." And he had looked at the cornbread and then looked at her and said very quietly, "I believe you." The timing was so precise and so unexpected that she had laughed before she could decide not to, and he had looked briefly startled by the sound of it, and then something had moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was the near neighbor of one. It was a small thing. She noted it anyway. Douglas Pratt came to Drystone on a Tuesday morning in the second week of October, when the first real frost had silvered the grass overnight and was burning off slowly in the early sun. Wren was at the garden when she heard the horse on the road. She did not look up immediately. She had learned, in the weeks since she had seen him in front of the barber shop, to move through her awareness of him carefully, the way you move through a room where something has been set down in the dark. You do not pretend it is not there. You simply do not step on it until you can see it clearly. She heard him introduce himself to Callum at the gate with the pleasant, measured voice she recognized. She straightened slowly and turned. He was perhaps 44, solid through the chest, the kind of build that had been athletic once and had thickened with the years without losing its fundamental confidence. His face was good-looking in a blunt, unremarkable way, the face of a man accustomed to being taken at his own assessment. He wore better clothes than anyone in Bitter Creek, and he knew it and had arranged his expression to suggest that he was gracious enough not to make anything of it. He turned from Callum and saw Wren. His eyes moved over her with the efficient assessment of a man cataloging an environment for relevant information. "You must be the new arrangement," he said. Callum took a single step forward, not aggressive, not dramatic. He simply moved so that he was standing between Douglas Pratt and Wren, and the movement was so natural and so without ceremony that a person watching from a distance might have thought he was simply shifting his weight. Wren noticed it. "Douglas Pratt," the man said, turning back to Callum. "I'm sure you remember me." "I remember you," Callum said. "I've been looking into some matters regarding the estate. Rosalind's welfare is naturally a concern for the family." "Rosalind left," Callum said, "on her own, in March." "Yes, there are some questions, however, about the circumstances, and about certain matters of property that may not have been properly resolved at the time of her departure. I think a conversation with a lawyer would be in everyone's interest." "Get off my land," Callum said. Still flat, still without heat or drama, just a fact stated plainly. Douglas Pratt produced a smile that had been manufactured for exactly this kind of conversation. He touched the brim of his hat in Wren's direction and turned his horse and rode back down the road toward town at an unhurried pace, the pace of a man who has delivered the message he came to deliver and is content to wait for it to work. After a moment, Wren walked back to the garden bed she had been working and crouched and put her hands in the soil. "He won't stop," she said. "No," Callum agreed. "Does he have grounds?" A long pause. "I don't know what he has," Callum said. The way he said it told her there was something he was not saying. Not a lie, but an incompleteness held back not from dishonesty, but from some habit of private containment so ingrained it had become structural. She nodded once and said nothing more. That night she opened the ledger and wrote down the date and every word of the conversation she could remember. Then she sat at the kitchen table and thought about what a man who wanted a ranch would need to have in order to take it, and what a man who owned a ranch would need to have in order to keep it. She opened the back of the kitchen drawer and found, filed away loose and without care, the original deed of sale for Drystone Ranch dated 1876 in Callum Hare's name, signed and witnessed. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it inside the front cover of the ledger and closed the ledger and put it back in the drawer. That night was the first night he talked about Ellen. She had gone out to the porch for air, the way she sometimes did when her mind was too occupied for sleep, standing in the cold with her shawl pulled close and looking at the stars that were abundant and indifferent and very far away. She had not expected to find him there. He was sitting in the rocking chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped between them, looking out at the dark land, and he did not turn when she came out, but he did not seem surprised either. She sat down on the porch step, pulled her shawl tighter, and said nothing. The silence lasted long enough that she thought he might simply prefer it. Then she asked, "Do you want to tell me about Ellen?" Not what happened, and not how did she die, and not any of the questions that would have required him to lead with the worst part. Only whether he wanted to tell her, whether that was something he had any use for. The pause was long, the kind that has weight in it, the kind where you can tell a person is genuinely deciding rather than simply delaying. She planted the first garden, he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of someone handling something fragile. Before we had enough water, before we had much of anything really. She said she needed to see something growing. Wren waited. She was good at that, at finding the thing you need before you know you need it. He paused. She died in January. The fever came fast, faster than either of us understood it could. There was a morning when she was better. I thought she had turned the corner. I went out to the south pasture to check the fence line because I had been neglecting it, and she had told me to go, that she was fine, that I should go. His hands moved against each other very slightly. When I came back, she was gone, just like that. The morning, and then not the morning anymore. The October dark sat around them, large and patient. I pulled up everything she had planted. After. I couldn't look at it. I thought I was being practical. There wasn't enough water to maintain it, and I couldn't look at it. A long breath, slow and controlled. Then I thought I would replant the next spring. Then the next spring I couldn't do that either. He stopped. I kept the seeds. I don't know why I kept them. I couldn't plant them and I couldn't throw them away. Because throwing them away would have been the last thing, Wren said quietly, and you weren't ready for it to be the last thing. He was quiet for a moment. I was afraid, he said. The words came out with the specific difficulty of a man who does not use that word often and has to work to release it. That if they grew again, I would start to forget what her hands looked like in the soil. Wren looked at the dark line of the garden, barely visible in the starlight, the small pale shapes of the bean shoots just discernible in the bed nearest the house. They grew, she said. And you still remember. He turned and looked at her. She could not see his face fully in the dark, but she could see that he was looking, and she looked back without adjusting anything. Yes, he said. One word. But the way he said it had something in it that all the previous silences had not had. A particular quality of having been opened, carefully and without being forced, like a window that has been painted shut for a long time and has finally been worked free, not broken, only opened, and the air moving through it for the first time. She did not reach for his hand. She sat on the step with her shawl around her shoulders and let the moment be exactly what it was, no larger and no smaller, not weighted with anything it had not earned. After a long while, he said, "You should go in. It's cold." "It is," she agreed. She stood and gathered her shawl. "Good night, Callum." It was the first time she had used his name. She did not make anything of it. She went inside and closed the door softly behind her and lay in the dark and listened to the chair on the porch rock in the slow way it rocked when a person was thinking rather than resting. She did not fall asleep for a long time. But when she did, she slept without interruption, deeply and without dreaming, the way you sleep when something that has been held tightly has finally, at least partially, been let go. The next morning, she found the key to the barn on the kitchen table. It was a plain iron key, nothing special about it except that it was his, and he had placed it there, at her side of the table, in the space where her coffee cup went. He was already gone to the north pasture when she came into the kitchen. She stood and looked at the key for a long time. Then she picked up her coffee cup and set it in its place, right beside the key, and drank her coffee standing at the window looking out at the garden where Ellen's tomato seeds were still waiting below the surface, patient as all things are, patient when the ground above them finally has enough water to make rising possible. She did not take the key. She left it on the table when she went out to work. When she came in at midday, it was gone. Neither of them said anything about it. But at supper that night, he passed her the bread before she had to reach for it, and she thought that sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that happen entirely without words, in the small adjustments of daily life that say, more precisely than language can, exactly what a person means. It was Greta Finch who told her the rest. She had ridden into town for salt, and she was tying her horse to the rail when the older woman appeared beside her with the specific purposefulness of someone who has been watching for an opportunity and has decided this is it. "Douglas Pratt," Greta Finch said without preamble. "He has a lawyer from Cheyenne. I heard it from the man at the land office yesterday. He's claiming the ranch is marital property. Says Callum drove Rosalind off, and she's entitled to her share. Can he do that?" "He can try." Greta Finch looked at her with those direct, unhurried eyes. "Whether he has the paperwork to support it, or whether he is manufacturing the paperwork to support it, I could not tell you. But I know Douglas Pratt, and I know the Pratt family. And I know that what they cannot take openly, they have a history of finding other means to obtain." Wren looked at the land office at the far end of the main street. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Greta Finch said. "Do something with it." She went back into her store before Wren could respond to that, which was, Wren thought, entirely characteristic of her. She rode back to Drystone in the cold October afternoon with the salt tied to the saddle and her mind turning over everything she knew and everything she did not know and everything she intended to do about all three. The ledger was in the drawer. The deed was in the ledger. She had been building something, one careful entry at a time, since the night she first heard a stranger ask about another man's land. She intended to finish it. The morning Douglas Pratt rode into Bitter Creek with a lawyer was a Thursday. Wren knew it was Thursday because she had been keeping the date in the ledger every night without exception, a habit her mother had insisted on from the time Wren was old enough to hold a pencil. The understanding that a date written down is a fact that cannot be argued with later, and that later, in Wren's experience, was precisely when certain kinds of men tried to argue. She had gone into town for wire to repair the section of fence on the east boundary that had been pulling away from the post since the ground shifted in the first hard frost. She had the wire coiled over the saddle horn, and she was riding back down the main street of Bitter Creek when she saw the crowd. Not a large crowd. Bitter Creek did not have the population for large crowds, but a gathering of perhaps 15 people on the street in front of the land office, which was enough in a town this size to constitute something significant. She slowed her horse. Douglas Pratt was standing on the steps of the land office with a man beside him she had not seen before, younger, carrying a leather document case with the careful possessiveness of someone whose value in this situation was entirely contained within it. Pratt was holding a folded document at the level of his chest, the practiced positioning of a man who understands that the suggestion of paper can be as effective as the paper itself when the audience does not know what the paper says. Callum was standing in the street below the steps. He was alone. He had his hat in his hands, which was the only visible sign that this was not an ordinary conversation, because Callum Hare did not remove his hat for ordinary conversations, and she had come to understand that the hat was, for him, a way of keeping the world at the distance he preferred, and its absence meant something had broken through that preference. She stopped her horse at the edge of the gathering and did not dismount. "The matter is straightforward," Douglas Pratt was saying, his voice pitched to Carrie. "My sister entered into a lawful marriage with Callum Hare in the spring of 1879. Under the laws of this territory, property acquired during the course of a marriage is considered marital property. Rosalind Hare has a legal claim to her portion of Drystone Ranch, and as her appointed representative, I am here to enforce that claim." The gathered people of Bitter Creek stood in the particular silence of a community that is watching something unfold and has not yet decided what it thinks about what it is seeing. Callum said nothing. Wren watched him from the edge of the crowd and felt, with a precision that surprised her, exactly what he was doing. He was not silent because he had nothing to say. He was silent because he had learned that defending himself in public was a transaction that always cost him more than it returned, that the people who wanted to believe the worst would find their way there regardless, and the people who knew him did not require his testimony. He had learned to absorb accusation the way weathered wood absorbs rain, without protest, taking it in and letting it work on him privately. She understood that kind of economy. She also understood that it was not going to be enough today. "The ranch was purchased in 1876, Callum said. His voice was flat and level and entirely without performance. 3 years before your sister and I were married. The deed of improvement, filed in 1880, lists the property as jointly held," Pratt's lawyer said, opening the document case. "That document is not legitimate," he said. "I would be very interested to hear you demonstrate that," Douglas Pratt said pleasantly. Wren looked at the crowd. She recognized most of the faces. Greta Finch at the back, watching with the still expression of a woman withholding judgment until she has all the information. She saw the moment Callum's shoulders changed. It was very small. A fraction of an inch. Barely perceptible. But she had spent 6 weeks learning the language of this man's body through the medium of working beside him, and she recognized it clearly. He was preparing to concede, not because he believed the claim, not because he thought Pratt's document was legitimate. He was preparing to concede because something in him believed at some fundamental level that holding on to things was a form of hubris that the land and time would correct eventually anyway, and that the correction might as well come now as later. She dismounted. She tied her horse to the rail with 2 quick loops and walked through the edge of the crowd and stopped in the street beside Callum. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. She looked at Douglas Pratt on the steps above them, and she was aware of being looked at in return, of being assessed and categorized and found unintimidating, of being the kind of woman that a man like Douglas Pratt glanced at and set aside as a variable that did not require significant calculation. She had spent her entire life being set aside as a variable that did not require significant calculation. She found it, at this particular moment, extremely useful. "Mr. Pratt," she said. Her voice was steady and clear and not loud. "The deed of improvement filed in 1880 that your lawyer is referencing, what does it list as the parcel boundary on the northern edge?" A brief pause. Douglas Pratt looked at her with the slight recalibration of a man who has had a question come from a direction he was not watching. "I'm not certain this is the appropriate—" "The northern boundary," she said again in the same even tone. The lawyer opened the document case and looked at the paper and read a number. Wren looked at Callum. "That boundary line was redrawn in the survey of 1881, she said, "after that document was supposedly filed. Any deed of improvement listing the pre-1881 boundary could not have been legitimately filed in 1880 because the 1880 survey still shows the old line. The document your lawyer is holding was written after the survey and backdated. The boundary coordinates prove it. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silence before it. The county land office keeps its own records, she said, independent of anything filed by private parties. The original deed for Drystone Ranch is dated 1876. You are welcome to check. She said it to the crowd as much as to Pratt because she understood instinctively what Callum had either never understood or had stopped believing was worth attempting. That public accusation requires public answer. That silence in the face of a lie told loudly enough eventually sounds like confirmation. Douglas Pratt stepped down from the steps. He was still pleasant. He was a man of considerable discipline, and the discipline held even now. "This is not finished," he said, close enough that only she and Callum could hear it. "I have resources you don't have, and time you don't have, and I intend to use both." "Then you'll use them against the county records," Wren said, "which are not mine to alter and not yours to dispute." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked to his horse and rode out of Bitter Creek with his lawyer behind him at a pace that was unhurried because hurrying would have suggested retreat. Greta Finch caught Wren's eye across the thinning crowd and gave her a single nod, small and decisive, the nod of a woman who has updated her assessment and found the result satisfactory. She thought it was over. She was wrong. Douglas Pratt came to Drystone 3 days later, at mid-morning when Callum was at the far boundary. A fact that Wren only understood in retrospect meant that Pratt had been watching the ranch closely enough to know when Callum would not be there. He knocked at the front door with the knuckle of one finger, twice, as though entering a business establishment. Wren opened the door and looked at him. He was alone this time. No lawyer, no document case. "Mrs. Cauley," he said, "a moment of your time. You can say what you came to say from there." Something shifted in his expression, small and quickly covered. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope and held it out. She did not take it. "There is a sum inside," he said, "that would allow you to leave Wyoming comfortably and establish yourself somewhere that does not require you to defend another person's property against legitimate claims. That land is not mine to sell. The offer is not for the land. It is for your absence. Your testimony complicates matters. Without it, the county records are subject to interpretation." She looked at the envelope. She thought about St. Louis. The dormitory above the factory with the thin walls and the mourning bell. The small room she had taken after the divorce, paying rent by the week because she could not afford the month. The dress she had been wearing the day she received Callum's letter, brown and invisible and chosen for its invisibility, the dress of a woman who had spent so long trying not to be noticed that she had nearly succeeded in not existing. She looked at Douglas Pratt. "I did not come here looking for a way back," she said. She said it quietly, without heat, without drama. The way you state a thing that is simply, entirely, irrevocably true. The pleasantness dropped away from his face, like a coat shrugged off. "You understand," he said, "that Callum Hare is not capable of the kind of feeling you are apparently hoping for. Ellen Hargrove took whatever he had to give, and she took it with her when she died. And what is left is not enough to build anything on. I am not saying this to be unkind. I am saying it because you have invested considerable effort in a situation that has no future. And I am offering you a practical alternative. She stood in the doorway in the cold October morning and felt the words attempt to find the places in her that were still uncertain, still unhealed, still capable of believing the worst, because the worst was what she had been taught to expect. She felt them. She did not let them in. "Get off this property," she said. "Don't come back." He stood on the porch step for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked to his horse and rode away without looking back. Wren closed the door. She stood in the kitchen for a moment with both hands flat on the table, pressing them down against the wood, feeling the grain of it under her palms. Her hands were not shaking. She was somewhat surprised to find they were not shaking. She took the ledger from the drawer and sat at the table and wrote down the date and the time and every word of the conversation she could remember, including the word absence and the phrase not capable of the kind of feeling. She wrote it all down because written things exist independently of the intentions of the people they implicate. Then she sat with the ledger closed in her hands and let herself feel, for a few private minutes in the empty kitchen, what she had not allowed herself to feel at the door. Not fear. Something older than fear and less dramatic. The particular ache of a woman who has been told repeatedly that she is not enough, not quite enough, not the right kind of enough, and who has spent years building herself around that absence the way a tree grows around a nail, incorporating the wound into the structure until the wound and the structure are no longer separable. She sat with it. She did not argue with it or run from it or try to resolve it faster than it wanted to resolve. She simply sat with it the way her mother had taught her to sit with difficult things, acknowledging them plainly and without flinching. Because a thing you will not look at directly is a thing that can surprise you. After a while, the feeling passed the way feelings pass when you give them the attention they require and refuse to give them more. She opened the ledger again and read through every entry from the beginning. And then she saw it. She went to the barn. Not for any practical reason she could have named. She went because something Douglas Pratt had said had shifted something in her, not toward doubt, but away from it, in the specific way that a cruel thing said about a person you have come to know well clarifies rather than obscures. The box was on the shelf where she had first seen it 6 weeks ago. She lifted it down and sat on the milking stool and opened it. The letters were tied with a blue ribbon, the knot still tight. She set them aside. Beneath them was a smaller book. Not a book exactly, more a stitched gathering of pages, the kind a person makes when they want to write things down but do not want it to look like a diary. The cover was plain gray cloth. She opened it to the first page. Rosalind Hare, née Pratt. March 1879. She read it the way she read important things, carefully and completely, and without skipping ahead to find the ending first. It took 20 minutes. When she was finished, she sat for a moment on the milking stool in the cold barn with the small gray book in her lap, and she thought about what she had read and what it meant. Rosalind Pratt had not left because Callum had done something wrong. She had left because she was afraid of herself. Afraid that she was not capable of loving a man who had loved someone else so completely. Afraid that she would always be second in a house where the first wife's seeds were still in a box on the kitchen shelf. She had written it plainly, the way people write things they cannot say aloud. He has done nothing wrong. He is exactly who I thought he was. I am the one who is not what I thought. I hope he finds someone who deserves the life he is trying to build. I was not that person. I knew it the day I arrived, and I spent 8 months trying to be wrong about it. Wren closed the book. She sat with it for a moment longer, thinking about a woman who had known her own limits and honored them, even at cost, even in the dark before sunrise. There was a particular kind of courage in that. Not the courage Wren had always practiced, the courage of staying and enduring, but a different kind. The courage of honest withdrawal, of refusing to take up space you know you cannot properly fill. She did not agree with the choice, but she understood it. She carried the box out of the barn and across the yard and into the kitchen where Callum was washing up at the basin, his back to the door, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. She set the box on the table. He turned, he looked at the box, he looked at her face, he looked at the box again, and something in his expression shifted in the way of someone who has been bracing for an impact for so long that when it finally comes, the sensation is almost a relief. I read it, she said. I needed to know what was in it. I should have asked. I didn't ask because I was afraid you'd say no, and I needed to know. He was very still. She didn't leave because of anything you did, Wren said. She left because she couldn't make herself into what she thought you needed, and she didn't know how to tell you that. She said you did nothing wrong. She wrote it plainly. She said you were exactly who she thought you were. The kitchen was very quiet around them. Callum looked at the box for a long moment without moving. Then he pulled out the chair and sat down. He reached out and lifted the gray book with the careful grip of a man handling something he has been afraid of for a long time and has decided, finally, to stop being afraid of. He read. She did not watch him read. She turned to the stove and put the kettle on because the kettle needed putting on and because some moments are not for watching, they are for being present near without intruding. She heard him reach the last page. She heard the particular silence that follows the end of a thing that has been carrying weight for a long time. Then she heard a sound she had not heard from him before. Not the controlled single tear of the porch in October. Not the careful, measured breath of a man keeping grief at a manageable distance. Something older and more thorough than either of those, the sound of a person who has been holding themselves responsible for a wound they did not inflict and has been shown, in plain handwriting on gray cloth pages, that the accounting they had been running in their own head was wrong from the beginning. She left the kettle and went to the table and sat down beside him. She did not say anything. He did not say anything either, for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough in a way she had not heard before. 2 years, he said. I thought... He stopped. I thought she found something in here that showed her who I really was, something that told her she had been wrong to come. She found something that showed her who she really was, Wren said. That's different. You didn't have to read it, he said. You could have left it. I know. Why? She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because you have been carrying a guilt that does not belong to you for 2 years, she said. And I have learned what that kind of carrying does to a person over time. I decided I would rather risk your anger at my reading it than watch you carry something that is not yours for another 2 years. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Not gently, not tentatively, firmly and completely, the way a person holds something they have decided they are not going to let go of. Thank you, he said. She turned her hand over and held his back. He stayed in the kitchen for a long time after that, She moved around him the way you move around someone who is processing something large and fragile, with the careful peripheral awareness of a person who does not want to intrude, but does not want to leave entirely either. She put water on for the beans she had been meaning to soak. She checked the fire in the stove. She found small tasks that kept her in the kitchen without requiring her to say anything that would interrupt whatever was happening in the particular silence he was sitting inside. The gray book lay on the table beside the box. He had closed it, but not put it away. His hands were flat on the table on either side of it, not touching it, but not far from it either. After a long while, he said, "I kept waiting for her to come back. Rosalind. In the first month, I thought she would. I thought whatever she had found, whatever had scared her, she would think about it and come back and tell me what it was, and we would work it out. I kept the horse ready. For 2 weeks, I kept the horse ready." Wren sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and let him talk. "After a month, I understood she wasn't coming, and I started to think about what she could have found. I went through everything in that barn 3 times. I couldn't find anything that would have made a person run like that, like she'd seen something she needed to put distance between herself and as fast as possible. I thought maybe I had missed something. I thought maybe there was something in me that was obvious to someone who lived with me, but that I couldn't see myself. Something wrong. Something that explained why I kept losing people." He looked at the gray book. 2 years of that. 2 years of waking up in the morning and thinking about what I might have done or failed to do that made a person leave before the sun was up without a word. He paused. "Turns out she just knew herself better than I knew myself at the same age. Turns out she was being honest in the only way she knew how to be honest, by going." He looked up at Wren. "I don't know what to do with that," he said. "I'm glad she went. I'm glad for both of us that she went. And I spent 2 years believing it was my fault. Both of those things are true at the same time, and I don't know what to do with them being true at the same time." Wren thought about what she knew about 2 contradictory things being true at the same time. "You hold them both," she said. "You don't resolve them. You hold them both, and you let them be what they are, and over time they settle into something you can live with. That's the best anyone can do with the things that don't resolve." He looked at her for a long moment. "You sound like you know that from experience." "I have some experience with it. Yes." He was quiet again, but this quiet was different from his other silences. His other silences had always had something held back in them, something withheld or contained or managed. This one was simply empty, like a room after something heavy has been moved out of it, the air settling into the space where the weight used to be. She found it, unexpectedly, one of the most restful silences she had ever sat inside. She opened the ledger again that evening and read through every entry from the beginning. All the dates, all the inventories, all the water levels and fence conditions and livestock counts. And then she saw it. Not the deed, which she had already verified. Something she had written down in the second week without understanding its full significance. A note about the county survey records that Greta Finch had quietly placed on her counter alongside the salt. A date and a number in the margin of the second page. The survey of 1876. The same year the ranch was purchased. Filed before the marriage, before Rosalind, before any of it. She read the number twice, and then she read the boundary coordinates on the original deed twice more, and she understood, with the specific clarity that comes when 2 pieces of information you have been holding separately suddenly resolve into a single picture: that the document Douglas Pratt had shown in front of the land office could not have been filed in 1880. It could not have been filed in 1879 either. The boundary coordinates on his document matched the post-1881 survey. No document using those coordinates could exist before 1881, which meant his document was not backdated to 1880. It was backdated across 3 years, the most provably false kind of forgery, the kind that collapses the moment someone thinks to check the survey dates against the coordinate system. She read the numbers a third time. Then she put the ledger in her coat pocket, the original deed folded inside the front cover, and she went outside and saddled the horse and rode toward the east boundary where Callum was working the fence line. She found him a mile out, crouched over a post that had heaved in the frost, working it back to plumb with the methodical, unhurried patience of a man who has repaired more fence posts than he can count. He looked up when he heard the horse. She dismounted and took the ledger from her pocket and opened it to the second page and held it out to him. "Read the survey date," she said. "Then read the boundary coordinates on the document Pratt showed at the land office, the ones his lawyer read out." He took the ledger, read it. She watched his face as he read, watching for the moment the picture resolved. It came. His jaw tightened and his eyes moved back to the top of the page, and he read it again. "The coordinates on his document," he said slowly, "cannot exist before the 1881 survey," she said. "The coordinate system they use was not adopted until 1881. Whatever his document claims to be dated, it was written after that survey." He was quiet. "This is what you brought to the street." "Part of it. The boundary discrepancy was enough for the crowd. This is enough for the judge." He looked up from the ledger. The October wind moved through the dry grass around them in long, patient waves, and the fence post stood straight in the ground between them, and the sky above Wyoming was the pale, cold blue of a season turning. "Wren," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She felt it the way you feel a thing you have been waiting for without letting yourself admit you were waiting. "I need to go to the land office," she said. "Today, before he has time to withdraw the filing. Once the judge sees the survey dates against the coordinates, the forgery is self-evident." "I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She folded the ledger back into her coat pocket and put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the horse, and he walked to where his own horse was tied to the fence and untied it and mounted without ceremony, and they rode toward town together in the cold October afternoon, the dry grass bending in the wind on either side of the road, the sky enormous and pale and entirely indifferent and somehow, for once, not unwelcoming because of it. She rode and thought about Douglas Pratt's last words on the porch step, not capable of the kind of feeling. She thought about a man who split firewood before dawn and left it stacked by the back door without mentioning it, a man who kept a lamp burning in the barn so the animals would not be in the dark, a man who had held the seeds of his dead wife's garden for 2 years because he could not plant them and could not let them go, and had finally, somehow, trusted her enough to let them be planted. She thought about his voice on the porch in the dark, saying the word afraid with the difficulty of a man releasing something he had held for a very long time. She thought, with the straightforward clarity that was her most reliable instrument, that Douglas Pratt was wrong. She had been wrong about many things in her life. She did not think she was wrong about this. The land office smelled of ink and paper and the particular dry warmth of a wood stove that had been burning since early morning in a small enclosed space. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man of perhaps 50, with the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had spent his working life managing documents that other people considered urgent and had arrived, through long practice, at the understanding that urgency and importance were not the same thing, and that his job was to be accurate rather than fast. He looked up when they came in. Wren placed the ledger on the counter and opened it to the second page and set the original deed beside it and explained, in precise and sequential order, what the survey dates showed and what the boundary coordinates on Douglas Pratt's filing proved and what she was asking the clerk to verify against the county's own records. She spoke for perhaps 4 minutes without interruption. The clerk listened with the full attention of a man who recognizes, when he hears it, information that is going to require him to do something he would prefer not to have to do. Then he went to the back room and returned with 2 ledgers of his own, large and bound in brown cloth, and he opened them on the counter and compared the numbers she had indicated with the numbers in the county record in silence, moving his finger along the columns with the deliberate pace of a man who is going to be completely certain before he says anything at all. Callum stood beside her at the counter and said nothing. The clerk looked up. "The coordinate system referenced in the Pratt filing," he said, "was adopted by this office in March of 1881. He paused. "Any document using this system could not have been legitimately created before that date." "The Pratt filing claims a date of 1880, Wren said. "Yes," the clerk said, "it does." "I will need to pull the original filing and mark it as disputed pending review," the clerk said. "You will need to make a formal statement, both of you." "We can do that now," Wren said. They did it now. She sat at the small table to the right of the counter and wrote her statement in the careful hand her mother had taught her, precise and sequential, without embellishment, only what she had observed and when she had observed it and what the records showed. Callum wrote his. Beside her, his handwriting larger and less practiced than hers but clear, the handwriting of a man who did not write often but wrote honestly when he did. The clerk witnessed both statements and filed them with the county seal and told them the matter would be reviewed by the territorial judge within the week. They walked out of the land office into the cold October afternoon. The street of Bitter Creek went about its business around them. A wagon moved past carrying lumber. The blacksmith's hammer rang out from the open shop. 2 women walked together on the opposite boardwalk with their heads close in the particular configuration of people sharing news. Callum and Wren stood on the step of the land office with the wide Wyoming sky above them, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "You've been carrying this for 3 weeks, he said. "I didn't know if it would be enough until I saw his document," she said. "The deed alone established the purchase date, but the coordinate system was what proved the forgery. I didn't have his document until Thursday." "You knew he had something." "I knew a man like that comes to a ranch he wants with something in his hand." She paused. "I have lost things before because I had no proof of what I knew. I was not going to let that happen here." He was quiet for a long moment. "When did you start keeping records?" "The ledger." "When did you start it?" "The first week. The night after I saw him at the general store." "Before you knew who he was?" "I knew enough. A man asking about a deed is a man who wants what the deed represents." He was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him. "You don't need to thank me," she said. "It's my ranch, too." She said it simply, without calculation, and she heard it land in the silence between them, and felt it settle there with the solidity of something that had been true for some time and was only now being said aloud. He heard it the same way. She could tell by the way he breathed. The 6 days between the land office and the judge's ruling were the quietest 6 days Wren had spent at Drystone. Not quiet because nothing was happening. The work of the ranch continued as it always continued, relentlessly and without regard for whatever legal proceedings might be unfolding in a courthouse in another town. The cattle needed water. The fence line on the north boundary needed a section replaced where the posts had heaved in the early frosts. The garden needed harvesting before the hard freeze came and took what was still on the vines. She and Callum worked through it together the way they had been working through things for 6 weeks, side by side and largely in silence, except that the silence now had something in it that had not been there before. Some quality of ease that she recognized as what she had been hoping for without letting herself name it as hope. She was cautious about naming things before they were certain. She had learned that lesson at 22 and had not forgotten it. But she noticed it. He woke before dawn every morning and built the fire before she got up, which she discovered on the 3rd morning when she came into the kitchen and found the stove already warm and a cup of coffee waiting on the table at her place. She stood and looked at it for a moment, the cup she had come to associate with his particular kind of practical kindness, the kind that expressed itself through action before it expressed itself through words. She picked it up and drank it and thought that some people speak primarily in gestures, and this was not a lesser language, only a different one, and that she had always been reasonably good at reading it. On the 5th day, in the late afternoon, she was turning the last of the squash in the garden, and she heard him laugh. Not at her, and not with her, but near her, behind her. And she turned to look. Jasper had apparently told him something, she had not heard what, and Callum was standing near the barn door with his hat in his hand, and his head tilted back slightly, and he was laughing in the full, uncomplicated way of a person who has been surprised by something genuinely funny and has no reason to manage the response. It was not a careful laugh. It was not the near neighbor of a smile she had cataloged in the first weeks. It was a real laugh, the kind that takes over the whole face and moves through the body, and it lasted 4 or 5 seconds before it settled back into the more familiar stillness. He looked over and found her watching him, and something passed between them that she did not have a clean name for, some acknowledgement of what she had seen and what it meant, communicated without words in the way that the most important things between people are usually communicated. Jasper ran off toward the barn for something, and Callum walked toward the garden and came to stand beside her and looked at the squash she had been turning in the late sun. "They'll keep better if we bring them in before the frost," he said. "I know, I was planning to do it tomorrow." He crouched beside her and picked up one of the larger ones, turning it over in his hands. "Ellen used to make a soup," he said. Not with grief in his voice, she noted, with the simple quality of a memory that has moved from painful to merely present, a fact about a person rather than a wound. With these, and the dried beans, and whatever else was still coming in, she said it lasted better if you let it sit overnight. "Most soups do," Wren said. "I don't have her recipe." "I don't need her recipe. I have mine." He looked at her sideways. Then he looked back at the squash. "That'll do," he said. She kept her eyes on the garden and did not let herself smile too widely, which would have been undignified, and instead made a small neutral sound of agreement, and went back to checking the squash. It was, she thought, an entirely adequate expression of where they were. The judge's ruling came on a Wednesday, 6 days later. Douglas Pratt's filing was dismissed as fraudulent. The territorial court found the coordinate system discrepancy to be conclusive evidence of forgery and referred the matter for criminal review. Drystone Ranch remained registered in the sole name of Callum Hare, as it had been since 1876, as it had always in fact been. Wren read the ruling at the kitchen table while the morning coffee was still hot. She read it once for the facts and once for the language, the specific legal language that made the thing permanent, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in the front cover of the ledger alongside the original deed and put the ledger back in the drawer. Then she went out to the garden. The tomatoes had ripened in the night. She had been watching them for days, checking each morning for the color change, the shift from the hard pale green of nearly there to the deep warm red of arrived. And this morning, when she came around the corner of the house and looked at the garden in the early light, she stopped walking because the sight of it stopped her. The vines were full and heavy, the fruit hanging in clusters in every stage from yellow blossom to deep red, and in the morning light they glowed with the specific warmth of things that have been given exactly what they needed and have responded with everything they had. Ellen's tomatoes. The seeds saved from the last crop, kept in a cloth pouch for 4 years through 2 winters and 1 abandoned marriage and 1 wife who could not stay, and 1 morning in January when a man came in from the south pasture to find that the thing he had been most afraid of had already happened while he was not watching. Wren crouched beside the nearest vine and looked at the fruit and thought about hands in soil and things kept against the possibility of planting, and the specific courage of a woman who saves seeds from her last crop because she intends for there to be a next one, even though she will not be there to plant it. She heard his boots behind her. He came from the barn the way he always came from the barn in the early morning, with the unhurried, deliberate pace of a man who has completed the first work of the day and is moving toward the next. She heard him stop. She picked 1 tomato, red and smooth and warm from the night, and stood and turned and held it out to him. He looked at it in her palm for a long moment. Then he took it. He held it with the careful grip of a man who has learned through loss to hold things with full attention. "She would have liked you," he said. His voice was low and even and entirely without performance. It was the most unguarded thing she had heard him say. She felt it in the particular place where unguarded things land when you have been guarded yourself for a long time and have almost stopped expecting anyone else to be otherwise. "I think I would have liked her," Wren said. He looked at her over the tomato, with the expression that had no management in it. "I want to marry you properly," he said, "in the church, with witnesses." He paused, and in the pause, she could hear him working through something, the specific difficulty of a man asking for something he needs after a long period of having stopped believing he was allowed to need things. "Not because of the contract, because I'm asking." The garden was very still around them. The morning light came in low and clear from the east, the transparent October light that showed edges plainly, and she stood in it without softening anything about herself, and looked at this man who had given her coffee instead of a greeting and a locked room instead of an explanation, and who had planted nothing for 2 years because he could not bear to watch things grow in ground that had held his grief, and who had stood in the street of Bitter Creek with his hat in his hands, accepting accusation in silence because he had stopped believing that holding on was something he was permitted to do. She thought about all of it. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that had been held, she suspected, for considerably longer than the length of their conversation. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a ring. Silver, plain, worn smooth with years of handling. The kind of ring that has a history without requiring one to be explained. His mother's, she understood without being told, because some things are evident in the way they are held. He took her left hand and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit a little loose. The slight looseness of a thing made for someone else that has found its way, through the long movement of time and circumstance, to the right hand after all. She looked at it on her finger, silver and plain and worn smooth, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since before she could name the moment it had come undone. Then he kissed her, not tentative and not rushed. The kiss of a man who has decided something after long deliberation and is committed to the decision entirely. The basket of tomatoes tipped over at their feet, and the fruit rolled into the dry soil around the base of the vines, and neither of them noticed, and neither of them cared. He went to the barn and came back carrying the boots. She recognized them immediately, the small, narrow ones wrapped in brown cloth, the ones she had seen on her first day in the wagon bed and had understood without being told as the particular language of grief that cannot yet release what it is holding. He held them for a moment, looking at them with the same careful grip he had used on the tomato, the gray book, her hand. Then he went inside and came back with the wooden box from the barn shelf. He placed the boots inside it, folded in their brown cloth the way they had always been folded. He placed them beside the gray book, which was already inside. He closed the lid. He carried the box to the house and set it on the high shelf in the front room, the shelf above the window where the light came in the mornings. Not the barn, not the bottom of a wagon, not a place of waiting or carrying or not yet letting go. A place in the house, in the light. She should be in the house, he said, not in the dark. Wren looked at the box on the shelf and thought about what it meant to put a thing in the right place, not to forget it and not to be governed by it, but to set it where it could be part of the life, rather than the weight beneath it. Yes, she said, she should. Later they sat on the porch. 2 rocking chairs side by side, the old one and the one he had built in the quiet hours of the past weeks without mentioning he was building it, setting it on the porch one morning the way he set firewood by the back door, without ceremony or explanation, simply because it was needed. He poured coffee into the tin cup, the dented one, the one from the first day, and handed it to her. She turned it in her hands and felt the familiar weight of it and the familiar warmth, and thought about a woman stepping off a stagecoach in the dust of a Wyoming road, saying the truest thing she knew how to say, and a man turning away and then turning back with this cup in his hand. "You kept it," she said. "Of course," he said. "It's the cup I gave the woman who saved my ranch." She looked at him. "Is that what I did?" He looked back at her with the clear, direct gaze that she had come to understand as his most honest register. "Among other things," he said. Jasper appeared at the far end of the garden, running toward the house with his oversized boots and his straw-colored hair, shouting something that resolved as he got closer into distinct words. The yellow flowers came back on the tall vines. Callum looked at Wren. Wren looked at Callum. The boy arrived breathless at the garden fence and pointed at the far end of the tomato bed where the late blossoms had opened in the afternoon warmth, yellow and small, and entirely certain of themselves. "Miss Ellen's seeds," Jasper said, with the particular satisfaction of a child reporting something that confirms a belief he has held for some time. "I knew they would." Callum's hand found Wren's on the arm of the chair between them. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat on the porch of Drystone Ranch in the last light of an October afternoon and looked at the garden that had been dead for 2 years and was now full of things growing. And the meadowlark in the oak tree above the spring was doing what it always did, which was to sing precisely as it pleased into the enormous, indifferent Wyoming sky. And the sky above them was the deep, clear blue of a day ending well, the blue of a season that has finished its hardest work and is resting before whatever comes next. Wren looked at the ring on her finger. She looked at her hand, the scarred thumb, the thick calluses, the short, uneven nails cut by lamplight the night before she left St. Louis. The hands of a woman who had been told by enough people in enough ways that she was not quite enough, not the right kind of enough, not worth keeping. The ring sat on her finger, plain and worn and slightly loose. It fit. "I'm not beautiful," she had whispered on a dusty road in Wyoming, to a man she had not yet met, before she knew what the land would ask of her or what she would find when she dug deep enough. "That's fine," he had said. "I need honest, not perfect." On a quiet porch at Drystone, in the last warmth of an October afternoon, with the garden full and the spring running, and the meadowlark singing in the oak tree above the water she had found when everyone else had stopped looking, honest turned out to be the rarest thing either of them had ever held.